Hey there. Welcome to this deep dive. This is where we take, that pile of sources. You've got articles, notes, research, and we really dig in. We pull out the important stuff, those surprising bits, give you the context so you can get up to speed fast without feeling overwhelmed. And today, wow, we are diving into something pretty extraordinary, sort of hidden right there in Glades County, Florida, the Ortona Mounds. Forget what you think you might know about ancient Florida, this place. It opens up this whole world of ancient earthworks, canals, and, well, you'll see.
That's right. Ortona isn't just, another dig site. It's really like a keyhole looking into a highly organized ancient society down in South Florida. And we've got some fantastic sources to walk through today. Everything from the very first kind of confused observations back in the 1800s right up to modern archaeology reports and the latest research findings.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack the story of how we came to understand Ortona. From those early mistakes to the really mind-blowing discoveries made over the years. We're talking unexpected stuff like gold, and trying to figure out what it all tells us about just the incredible ingenuity of the people who built this place thousands of years ago. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's unpack this. The story really starts with people. Well, people getting it wrong. Back in the 1800s, you had these early American surveyors stumbling across these massive earthworks, these mounds in Florida. And they looked constructed. So naturally they thought, Spanish forts. Do you believe that? Mistaking these ancient indigenous sites for European constructions.
It seems kind of wild now, doesn't it? But yeah, that was the thinking for a bit. Fortunately, that started to shift. By the 1880s, scholars were beginning to recognize, okay, these are definitely indigenous, not Spanish. One of the earliest official notes is actually in an 1882 Smithsonian report. It mentioned extensive ancient canals right there in the Lake Okeechobee area, near Ortona specifically.
Okay, so the canals caught their eye early on. What about the actual mounds?
Right, the mounds themselves got their first real published mention in 1887. It was in a journal called the American Antiquarian. And this notice, it documented these large artificial embankments and the canals around Lake Okeechobee that really put Ortona on the map, so to speak, for the small archaeological community back then.
So early notice, but still a bit fuzzy. Then you get people actually visiting in the early 20th century, like Alisher Lichka, the physical anthropologist.
Exactly. He visited in 1918 and wrote about it in his book, The Anthropology of Florida. He was one of the first to specifically describe the main mound, measure it even, noted its pretty impressive size, about 160 by 130 feet at the base, and around 30 feet high. And it wasn't just anthropologists. You had botanists, too, like John Kunkel Small. He traveled through in the 1910s, 1920s. He wrote these accounts just marveling at the sheer scale of the canals and earthworks. He correctly saw it as evidence of a once extensive artificial landscape. By the 1930s, you had others like Henry Collins and John Griffin starting to compile more, let's say, formal surveys.
Okay, so even before any real scientific digging started, these early visits were making it clear Ortona wasn't random. It was a major prehistoric center with these unique, large-scale engineered features that really stood out.
Which brings us neatly to the first professional archaeologist to actually excavate there. John Goggin from the University of Florida. This was in 1952. He opened up test trenches in one of the large mounds. Goggin was, quite systematic for his time. He documented multiple mounds, gave them the official site numbers we still use, like HGL4, HGL5, and he estimated the whole site covered a pretty big area, maybe 40, 50 acres, with at least 20 major earthwork features, all seemingly linked by those ditches and canals people had noticed earlier. His dig in 52 in the main mound, 8GL5, found these stratified layers, different levels of sand and artifacts showing distinct periods of occupation over a long time. He didn't fully publish everything back then, but it strongly suggested a deep history at the site.
So his work kind of solidified it.
Exactly. By the mid-20th century, thanks to Goggin, Ortona was firmly recognized by archaeologists as this large, planned, prehistoric town. With these really distinct engineered features, its importance was basically established.
Okay, hold on. Now, for a really dramatic twist, almost like something out of a movie, we need to talk about Montague Talent.
Yeah.
He was an amateur archaeologist, yes, but also a furniture dealer, active in the 1930s, doing his own digs around 1930.
Right, Talent. He's a fascinating figure.
And he drew his own map, a hand-drawn map of the site. And on it, he recorded something really striking. This big zigzag earthwork. He actually called it a serpent mound, said it had 3 segments, a sort of V-shaped head.
Okay.
And right near the end, he mapped a U-shaped burial mound about 5.5 feet tall.
Yeah, his map is interesting, but unfortunately, Talent's main goal was collecting artifacts, not necessarily, careful scientific recording like we do today. He dug into that U-shaped mound, and the reports say he found a lot of grave goods, numerous items, but in doing so, the mound itself was completely leveled, destroyed. Still, that 1930 map is valuable because it shows features like that zigzag embankment that later professional surveys actually missed or couldn't locate anymore.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. The part that makes everyone lean in, Talent's digs at Ortona. They uncovered an absolutely extraordinary collection of prehistoric gold and metal artifacts.
Oh, unbelievable finds, just incredible. Among everything he recovered, there were pieces made of gold, silver, copper, even tumbaga, that's a gold-copper alloy. Two pieces especially are just world famous in archaeology circles. First, there's this small, solid gold figurine. It looks like maybe a panther or a jaguar, really delicate features. And on its back, it's decorated with a cross and circle motif. That's a really powerful symbol you see across native southeastern art.
Wow.
Second, there's this hollow pendant, gold or tumbaga, shaped like a bird, maybe an owl, and it has three tiny little bells attached. Sometimes it's described as a turtle shell effigy pendant. Both are just incredibly sophisticated pieces artistically, totally unlike the usual shell or bone artifacts you typically find at Florida sites. Talent himself was puzzled. He reached out to experts like Matthew Sterling at the Smithsonian. Sterling connected him with Samuel Lothrop at Harvard.
Okay, so what did the big shot archaeologists think? Were they made by the Ortona people?
Well, Lothrop, he was an expert in Latin American archaeology. He compared Talent's finds to collections from down there and saw really strong similarities to pre-Columbian gold work from places like Colombia and southern Mexico. To check this, Sterling actually got chemical analysis done on the gold way back in 1935. And that analysis found trace amounts of platinum. Now that's consistent with alluvial gold sources found in Colombia. And get this, one of the pendants turned out to be virtually identical to specific Mixtec gold turtle shell pendants from Oaxaca in southern Mexico.
Hold on. Mixtec pendants.
Yeah.
From Oaxaca. Colombian gold. Does that mean people from Mexico or Colombia actually came all the way to Florida back then and brought this stuff?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it was definitely debated early on, but the consensus among archaeologists today is probably not. It's not seen as evidence of direct contact or migration from that far away. The conclusion most scholars have reached is that Florida's native peoples, most likely the Calusa, or their allies who controlled that area in the 16th century, got these exotic treasures through Spanish shipwreck salvage. Or maybe coastal trade right around that early contact period.
Yeah, wrecks. Wow.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how they use them. The 16th century Florida Indians didn't just melt them down. Sometimes they'd rework things, like cold hammering Spanish silver into ornaments they liked. But other times, they kept these pre-Columbian pieces exactly as they were if the imagery resonated with their own beliefs. So the jaguar or panther, the bird motifs, those were already powerful symbols in Florida native religion. So those gold pieces were kept intact, treated as sacred, powerful objects.
Wow. So these aren't just artifacts. They're artifacts with, like, multiple lives. Made somewhere else, lost in a shipwreck, found by Florida natives, and then woven into their own spiritual worlds. That is truly unexpected.
It really is. Talent's recovery of these, despite his methods, was incredible. He did carefully catalog his finds by site, which is helpful. And then in the late 1930s, he made a really smart move. He sold his entire collection stuff from over 169 different sites to the Bradenton Junior Chamber of Commerce, but with one condition: it had to stay local in the region. And that collection, it became the foundation for the South Florida Museum, which is now the Bishop Museum of Science and Nature.
So you can actually go see this Ortona gold today.
Yes, absolutely. The Bishop Museum has the Montague Talent collection. You can see the gold figurine, the bird pendant, tons of other metal artifacts Talent found at Ortona. And research by archaeologist Jeffrey Mitchum, looking at the whole collection, confirmed that Ortona and a nearby site called Nicodemus had by far the largest amount of metal artifacts from any known Florida sites. It really underscores Ortona's role as this major center, a place where prestige goods accumulated, connected into these long-distance, if indirect, trade networks. But it is, as you said, a complex legacy. Talent gave us these amazing objects, revealed this unexpected wealth and connection, but his digging destroyed the context of that U-shaped burial mound. That's information lost forever.
Yeah.
It really highlights that tension between finding cool stuff and preserving the scientific story.
Right. A real double-edged sword. Okay, so after Talent and the gold, Ortona got some attention here and there, but things really ramped up again in the late 80s, early 90s. That's when modern research really kicked in. A key step was in 1989, establishing the Ortona Indian Mound Park. That protected about 40 acres, gave researchers a base.
Exactly. And that's when the Archaeological and Historical Conservancy, led by archaeologist Robert S. Carr, launched some major research efforts. Early 1990s, they did comprehensive mapping, used modern methods for digging test trenches, and crucially, got radiocarbon dates. Their big report came out in 1995. They documented all the different kinds of mounds, rectangular platforms, these long loaf-shaped ones, circular mounds made of village trash middens, and linear embankments. And they clearly mapped at least two really extensive engineered canals, but they also had to document just how much damage the site had already suffered over the years.
Damage? What kind of damage are we talking about? Heavy stuff.
Oh yeah, decades of development, resource extraction. It took a huge toll. There was this large linear mound, Mound B, sometimes called the Great Mound, originally maybe 500 feet long, kind of loaf-shaped, almost completely wiped out by sand mining in the mid-20th century. Carr's team could only find bits of it. And Mound D, this massive ridge, 500 by 70 feet maybe, possibly an engineered causeway or platform, severely bulldozed by the 90s. Carr actually saw some of the destruction happening. He noted layers of dark soil and pottery right near the top, showing intense human activity had been there.
Man, that's rough.
It is. But their careful digs in the mounds that are still well preserved, like Mound A, confirmed they were habitation mounds, built up over time, layers of dark soil, animal bones, broken pottery, daily life stuff. This showed that Ortona's people built mounds for different reasons. Some were basically villages built on their own refuse, probably to stay above floodwaters. Others were clearly deliberate, planned constructions, maybe for ceremonies or elite residences. And those radiocarbon dates they got in the 90s. They placed the first mound building around 8300-400. The main period of occupation, when most of the big stuff was happening, seems to be between 8500 and 800. That puts it squarely in Florida's late woodland period, often linked to the Belle Glade culture.
Okay, now this brings us to maybe the most astonishing part of Ortona, the sheer scale of their engineering, especially those canals. The site's about 3 miles north of the Caloosahatchee River near Lake Okeechobee. And the people here, they didn't just live near the water. They totally reshaped the landscape, dug these massive canals to connect to Ortona, which is on a smaller creek, Turkey Creek, south to the Caloosahatchee River and east towards Lake Okeechobee.
This canal system is. It's just an absolute marvel of ancient engineering. Ryan Wheeler did a study back in '95 looking specifically at the hydraulics. He found these weren't just simple ditches. They were wide 20 to 30 feet across in places, relatively shallow, maybe 3-4 feet deep, but, and this is key, they were carefully graded to manage the water flow across the flat landscape. Really sophisticated. You had this network, one canal running east-west for about 4 miles, another going north-south for maybe 3 miles. They basically formed a big triangle with the Caloosahatchee River as one side, and the main village area of Ortona, right at the top point, the apex. These canals are basically a prehistoric highway system for canoes. They let people bypass tricky rapids on the river, creating this incredible inland waterway across Florida, linking the Gulf Coast with the Lake Okeechobee Basin.
And that scale is just mind-boggling for that time. But here's the real kicker, right? When Carr's team actually dated the canals, what did they find?
This is where it gets truly amazing. They dug trenches right across one of the canal segments. And down at the very bottom, preserved in the muck, they found logs and other organic stuff from when it was first dug. They sent these samples off for radiocarbon dating.
And the dates came back?
Centering around AD 250, roughly. This finding, published in the Florida Anthropologist in 2002, was just extraordinary. It proved that the construction of this huge canal network was happening over 1,700 years ago, and that immediately made Ortona's canal system the oldest known artificial canal network in North America.
Wait, the oldest? Seriously, older than anything, like up in the Midwest or out west?
Yeah. Significantly older than other systems that people thought were the oldest in the U.S. As archaeologist James Brown said, this was basically the smoking gun. Proof that an indigenous culture, right here in Florida, during the Middle Woodland period, the same time as the famous Hopewell culture way up in Ohio, was capable of designing and building monumental architecture and engineering on just a breathtaking scale. The calibrated dates, roughly AD 200 to 400, put the canal building right in the heart of that Hopewell incraction sphere time frame. It suggests that even the interior wetlands of Florida were somehow plugged into that larger pan-regional network of shared ideas about ceremony, trade, maybe even landscape engineering.
So they're building these massive waterways incredibly early. What else did the modern research find about their landscape shaping? Any other big projects?
Oh yeah. Beyond the canals, the work in the 90s found other pretty remarkable geometric features. For instance, near the main village area, they mapped this really striking 450-foot-long rectangular pond.
A rectangular pond.
Yeah, not natural. Clearly a man-made basin dug down about 4 feet deep. And its shape is very specific, this long, narrow rectangle, but with distinctly rounded ends. Archaeologists looked at that shape and immediately saw a resemblance to a ceremonial mace or baton.
A mace.
Yeah.
Like a weapon or symbol of power.
Exactly. In the art and symbolism of Eastern Woodlands peoples, the mace or scepter was a really potent symbol, often represented chiefly power, authority, maybe cosmic order, often linked to the sun. And the dating showed the batpon was built around AD 700, so after the main canals were already in use. And they even found evidence it was originally ringed with this sort of beach of bright white sand, which would have looked amazing and had to be brought in.
Wow, so not just a pond.
Probably not just a pond, no. The interpretation is that this was likely a ritual feature, maybe a water-filled ceremonial plaza, deliberately shaped like this powerful cosmic symbol. Carr pointed out that these kinds of dramatic landscape changes, the canals, the Batten Pond, they show a really high level of social organization and planning. It confirms Ortona wasn't just a place to live, it was also a major ceremonial center that physically built sacred space right into its design.
It really sounds like Ortona was the place to be during its peak. It was like a regional hub, a center for everything.
It certainly looks that way. By the early 2000s, the research painted this picture of Ortona as a really critical regional hub. For trade, for communication, probably for ceremony too. Its location was just strategically brilliant. Right near the headwaters of the Caloosahatchee River, so you could canoe west all the way to the Gulf. And it was close to major portage routes over to Lake Okeechobee, which then opens up connections east to the Atlantic via the Kissimmee and St. Johns River systems. Scholars think Ortona was basically this vital crossroads connecting north-south routes through the interior with these east-west routes across Florida.
So what kind of stuff would have been moving through there? What were they trading?
You can imagine all sorts of goods. Stuff from the Everglades and the coasts probably moved north through Ortona. Things like alligator hides, shark teeth, fancy bird feathers, valuable marine shells. And in return, things from further north would come south, maybe flint for tools, exotic materials like copper, maybe already worked into things like panpipes or ear spools, perhaps special ceremonial pottery or effigy pipes. The fact that we find these non-local materials at Ortona, even if not in huge amounts, strongly supports this idea of it being a key node in these exchange networks.
But it didn't last forever. When did its prominence fade?
It seems like Ortona's main period of importance started to wane around AD 800 or so. This might be tied to shifts in power in the region. Later on, by around AD 1200, you see the rise of this really powerful chiefdom, the Calusa, who dominated South Florida. Their center was likely further west, closer to the coast.
So Ortona was abandoned.
Not necessarily overnight. There's evidence suggesting the site, or at least the immediate area, was probably still inhabited into the later Mississippian period. Maybe even right up to European contact in the 16th century. Spanish records mention the Calusa controlled this general region. And remember, all that Spanish-derived metal talent found? That could suggest activity or maybe people reusing the site during that early contact era. But sadly, the original culture, the people who actually built Ortona, they ultimately disappeared. Part of that catastrophic collapse of Florida's indigenous populations by the 1700s due to European diseases, warfare, and enslavement.
It's such a powerful story. Incredible achievement and then just devastating loss. You mentioned the damage the site suffered earlier. How much of this amazing ancient landscape is actually still visible today? Can you go see it?
That's a really critical point. And unfortunately, yeah, a lot of the original landscape has been severely impacted or destroyed. It started way back in the 1880s with Hamilton-Diston's huge drainage projects, which altered the water levels. Then, in the 1940s and 50s, road construction went right through the site, actually demolished a 20-foot-high burial mound, one of the most prominent features. And those sand mining operations in the 70s and 80s were just brutal. Gutted huge sections of some of the biggest mounds like B, C, and D.
Wow.
That's why Robert Carr's documentation work in the 90s was so vital. They were literally recording features just before they vanished completely. Today, part of the site is protected. It's the Ortona Indian Mound Park, and you can visit it. But many of the most significant features, like the canals and the Batten Pond, are actually still on private land. Their survival really depends on the goodwill of the landowners.
That sounds precarious.
It can be. But there have been some successes. Groups like the Archaeological Conservancy have worked with local ranchers to actually acquire crucial pieces of land, including the area with the Batten Pond, specifically to protect them. And there's an ongoing effort to get the Ortona Canal System nominated as a National Historic Landmark to really highlight its national significance, similar to how the Mud Lake Canal down in Everglades National Park is recognized.
It's good to hear there are efforts to save what's left. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about how archaeologists interpret all this. These really unique earthworks must have sparked some interesting ideas about what they meant, right? And the culture that built them.
Absolutely. Most archaeologists place Ortona within what's called the Belle Glade cultural tradition of South Florida. It was distinct, had its own flavor, but was clearly connected to that broader world of mound-building cultures across the Southeast. Its peak time, remember, AD 200 to 700, overlaps big time with the Middle Woodland and Hopewell era further north. That suggests ideas about building these big geometric landscapes were spreading widely, reaching all the way down into Florida's interior wetlands. And the geometric layout at Ortona, those linear mounds, the rectangular pond, the precise canals, it definitely sits within that whole family of eastern woodlands ceremonial landscapes. But what makes Ortona unique is how it's adapted to that specific environment, the Everglades region. These people had to literally engineer the ground beneath their feet to live there and build these structures. And there's that key difference we talked about earlier. The Ortona people built habitation mounds, practical platforms to live on, get out of the floodwaters, alongside their more obviously ceremonial constructions. That blending of the sacred and the practical is different from, say, the Ohio Hopewell, who mostly use their mounds for burials and rituals. It's a really unique cultural adaptation to their specific place.
What about the symbolism? You mentioned the Batten Pond looking like a mace.
Right, the Batten Pond is a great example. Its shape, resembling that ceremonial mace, is strongly interpreted as symbolizing chiefly power, cosmic order, maybe linked to the sun. And what's really fascinating is its orientation. The long axis of that pond isn't random. It's aligned precisely 20 degrees west of north.
20 degrees.
Now,
That sounds really specific. Does it line up with the sun or moon or anything obvious?
not with true north or the solstices or equinoxes, which are common alignments you see at other sites. It's odd. Some researchers speculate that this specific angle, and you actually see similar, slightly off cardinal alignments at other ancient eastern woodland sites too, might relate to the rising or setting of particular bright stars, or maybe constellations, or even specific points in the moon's cycle. It's hard to prove for sure without more data, but the fact that they chose that precise angle strongly suggests it encoded some kind of astronomical or cosmological reference that was important for their rituals or maybe their calendar.
And didn't you mention something about a crescent and star shape being interpreted there too?
Yes, the signage at the park points this out. One of the curved embankments seems to form a crescent shape, and it might be positioned relative to another feature in a way that suggests it's holding a star. That crescent and star motif is something you also see in later Mississippian art further north. Again, these are interpretations, but they fit this broader pattern we see across the eastern woodlands, where people seem to have been modeling elements of their cosmology, their understanding of the universe, directly onto the landscape with their earthworks.
Okay, but then there's the really controversial one, right? Going back to Talent's map and that zigzag thing he calls a serpent mound. The comparison to the famous serpent mound in Ohio is just obvious.
That's hard to ignore, yeah. And that leads to perhaps the most debated interpretation currently.
Which is the idea linking it to a specific constellation.
Exactly. In 2020, a researcher named Gary C. Daniels proposed a hypothesis that Ortona's serpent-like mound wasn't just snake-like, it was built specifically to represent the constellation Serpens Caput, the head of the Serpent constellation. Now, if that's correct, it would potentially make it the oldest known constellation effigy mound in the Americas, predating the Ohio Serpent Mound by centuries.
Wow. What's the evidence? Is it just that it's wiggly?
It's a bit more specific than that. Daniels points to Talon's original map, showing those three segments ending in a V-shaped head, which he argues looks like a snake eating something. But the strongest piece of evidence, he argues, is that Talon's map also noted a small circular mound located right at the juncture between the tail and body segments of his serpent shape. According to Daniel's analysis of star charts, that specific location corresponds exactly to where the brightest star in the Serpens Caput constellation, a star called Unukalai, would be positioned within that constellation shape in the night sky. It's a pretty compelling alignment if Talon's map was accurate.
If it was accurate.
Right. That's the big caveat. Talent wasn't using modern survey gear, and the feature itself has been damaged over time, maybe even completely obliterated in places. So, while the serpent motif itself is definitely present in Florida, prehistory, you see snakes on Belglade pottery. On Copperplex, this specific link to the constellation Serpens Caput is still very much a hypothesis. It needs more investigation, maybe trying to relocate the feature using geophysics, and careful checking against Talent's potentially imprecise map. But it's an incredibly intriguing idea, isn't it?
Absolutely. It just pushes the boundaries of what we imagine these ancient Floridians were thinking about, literally connecting the earth and the sky like that. What about other interpretations? I feel like I've heard whispers about connections to Mesoamerica, like the Maya. Anything to that?
Yeah, that's another interpretation that pops up now and then, usually based on perceived similarities in certain architectural forms. For instance, some people have looked at that U-shaped embankment talent found near a level area and wondered if it could maybe resemble the layout of ball courts found at Maya sites, leading to speculation about shared rituals or even migration. There's also some archaeological evidence, a sort of hard, stucco-like surface made from sand and burnt shell found on one mound that looks a bit like the lime plasters used in Mesoamerica.
So, possible links.
Well, it's important to say this is definitely a minority view among most Florida archaeologists. The mainstream consensus is that while there might have been very occasional indirect exchange of ideas across the Gulf of Mexico, the similarities we see are much more likely due to independent local developments. Complex societies often come up with similar solutions or build similar kinds of monuments when facing similar challenges or having similar ideas about status and ceremony, even without direct contact. So, analogous responses, maybe a little bit of idea diffusion, are seen as much more probable than any significant migration from Mesoamerica influencing Ortona.
Okay, so pulling it all together on interpretations.
Right. To sum up, well, you have these really fascinating, sometimes controversial ideas floating around the constellation effigy. The potential Mesoamerican hints, the prevailing view among archaeologists, sees Ortona's incredible achievements primarily as a homegrown cultural fluorescence. The engineering of the canals, the planned geometric layout, the potential astronomical symbolism, the complex society needed to build it all. It's seen as a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of the native peoples of the Glades region. They uniquely engineered their challenging landscape for both practical survival travel, living above floods, and for deeply significant ceremonial purposes, creating a place that really embodied their worldview and facilitated their economy in their specific Florida environment. Oh, and one final point on interpretation is kind of interesting: the lack of obvious defensive features. Early researchers noted there weren't any big palisades or defensive walls around the main core of Ortona. This suggests that during its peak period, the people there felt relatively secure. Maybe they were living in a time of peace or had strong alliances. Some research suggests many South Florida earthwork sites flourished during a relatively peaceful window, maybe between 100 BC and 8400. Ortona's open layout seems to fit that, suggesting prosperous trade and interaction were more key to its identity than warfare, at least during its heyday.
Wow. Okay. We have really journeyed through the layers of Ortona in this deep dive. I mean, starting from being mistaken for a Spanish fort to revealing itself as this incredibly complex center. Ancient engineering on a massive scale, evidence of far-reaching trade, that unexpected gold, and even possibly encoding celestial symbols right into the ground. It's amazing.
It really is a powerful reminder of what we can learn when we piece together different kinds of evidence. Old records like Talent's map, careful analysis of artifacts like that stunning gold, and modern archaeological science like dating and mapping. Even with all the damage the site has suffered, we've managed to reconstruct so much about this truly sophisticated ancient culture right here in Florida.
It definitely makes you stop and think, what is the story of Ortona, a place where people were engineering landscapes on this scale, possibly mapping the cosmos, over 1,700 years ago? What does that really tell us about the depth of knowledge ancient peoples had, about their world, their environment, maybe even the stars?
Exactly. And maybe it makes you wonder, how does uncovering places like Ortona change the way you look at the landscapes around you? Knowing that there could be these complex hidden histories, these incredible feats of engineering and symbolism just lying beneath the surface or hinted at in the subtle shapes of the land.
Absolutely. Lots to think about. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Ortona Mounds.